Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Romans 10:5-13, in case anybody's following. Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, "Do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, or who will descend into the deep." But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
Every year, our 7th graders meet to talk about questions of faith, learn the history of the church and United Methodist traditions, and explore the church. The hope is that at the end of the year, our students will claim for themselves the promises made on their behalf by their parents at their baptism. We meet in small groups for discussion and activities with other adult leaders from the church. We've asked a few of this year's confirmands to share some of their favorite and most meaningful pieces from this past year.
My favorite part of confirmation was getting to volunteer in different places with different people and get to see their smiles on their faces. It was just really joyful.
My favorite part of confirmation was growing in my faith and growing closer to my friends.
Well, my favorite part of confirmation was really learning about how our journey of God compares to God's journey through Jesus. A lot of his story kind of compares to ours very similarly.
My favorite part of confirmation was growing closer with my friends while doing activities with them.
My favorite memory of confirmation class was making my stole. It helped me reflect on myself and on my faith.
My favorite memory was picking out Christmas gifts for the children of the Ohana house.
My favorite memory from confirmation was definitely all the friends I made. A lot of the people there helped to support me in so many different ways. I can't thank them enough.
My favorite memory from confirmation class was during Family Promise, and I got to be with these 2 girls and help them and play games with them and have fun with them. It was just a really cool experience.
What I learned the most is what confirmation means and how to interpret the Bible.
What I learned the most is how to grow in my faith and what my faith means to me.
A lot of what I've learned is mainly based around the stories of Jesus. Some stories that we were building on from preschool and 1st grade.
You know, we were just blessed with these amazing people and amazing things that we have in our lives.
Have you ever made a promise, but then after you made it, sometime later, you wished you hadn't made that promise? Have you ever done that before? Yeah? Nathan's hand went up. Have you ever said, like for the kids in the room, have you ever said that you would do something like rake the leaves or wash the dishes or pick up your clothes, but then you really just didn't feel like doing it, right? Yeah, I saw some hands, some nodding of heads. Have you ever said that you would be there, like hang out with someone, and then later on another opportunity came along and it was like, oh, I wish I hadn't already made plans. Like you guys, have you ever said that you're going to do a project with someone at school, and then along comes someone else that you really wish could be your partner, and they say, hey, you want to partner up with me, but you've already just told someone else that you'd be their partner? Have you ever have made a promise and then found out down the road that keeping that promise cost you more than you thought it would? Then you have the beginning of what a covenant is. A covenant it's kind of a central concept in Scripture. It's an agreement between two people, a mutual set of promises. But it's different from the way our world works today. Today, we tend to work not by covenant, but by contract. Contract is you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I want something you have, so if I give you this, will you share it with me? You know, it's a deal, a contract is. And the contract holds as long as it serves both our purposes. But as soon as something else comes along that might be better, well, then we renegotiate the contract or we forget it, break it altogether. But that's not the way covenants work. Covenants are promises. And covenants bind people together. And ultimately, a covenant isn't about what you can get out of it. Rather, a covenant is about loyalty and faithfulness. One of my favorite sermons on this topic is from a pastor named Lewis Smedes, and he said, if you have a ship that you will not abandon, if you have a cause that you cannot give up, if you have people that you will never leave, then you are like God. Because God, our God, is a God of covenants, which means that God operates in the world by making and keeping promises. And when we read the Bible, what we're reading about is all of those promises that God has made. Now, one of the first promises I learned when I was in Sunday school, you know, I think from what comes to most of our minds is the rainbow, right? You know, that God put a rainbow in, that was a covenant, a promise that God made to Noah, saying, I will never again destroy the earth with flood like this. So it doesn't matter how bad the storm gets, we have a promise that at some point that storm will end. It won't go forever. But the most important, the central covenant throughout all of the Old Testament is the covenant that God makes between himself and the people of Israel. God promises the people of Israel, I will be your God. I will watch over you. I will protect you. I will provide for you. I will take care of you. And they, in turn, promise to love God and obey all of his commandments and follow whatever he says. That's the central covenant of the Old Testament. Moses, whom you guys learned about in Sunday school, Moses summarizes it really well in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 30, this is the last words that Moses speaks to the people of Israel. He's been leading them in the desert, led them out of Egypt. For 40 years, he's been their leader. And these are the last words he says to them. He says, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity or death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, observing his commandments, then you shall become numerous, and the Lord will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days. It's one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament. It's so clear, isn't it? I'm giving you a choice, life or death, and we're all going to choose life, right? You know? And like I said, the context of this is the people are about to enter into the promised land, a promise that they have held on to for over a generation, believing that someday God would settle them in a land flowing with milk and honey, and that day has come. And so God has kept God's end of the bargain, and now the people are making their promise back to God. And caught up in the moment, perhaps, of Moses' last speech, they all, cross their hearts and hope to die and say, we will follow and love you, God, forever. But that's not quite the way the story goes in the Old Testament. If they did that, that'd probably be the end of the story, but it's not, because people being people, the Israelites wander away and they get a little lost. And they turn away from the God who loved them and made covenant with them. But that doesn't mean that God breaks the covenant. Yes, they experience what God promised. They experience adversity and curses, but God does not abandon them. In fact, he keeps sending prophets to them, one after the other, calling them back, saying, remember who you are. You belong to me. And eventually one of those prophets comes along named Jeremiah, and he says, maybe it's time for a new covenant. Actually, the way he says it is like this. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant which they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. They shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. Did you catch that? The old covenant, the people broke, they forgot. Jeremiah says, with this new covenant, I'm going to write it on their hearts. They will not be able to forget. They will know me. They will keep my laws, and I will forgive them and remember their sin no more. Now, as Christians, we believe this new covenant came about through Jesus, God's Son. That through Jesus, God extends his covenant, not just to the people of Israel, but to people of all ages and nations and races, that it's through Jesus that we get to be part of God's chosen people. We are people of this new covenant. But what does that mean? I mean, how do we enter into that covenant? And the old covenant, it was pretty cut and dry, right? If you do this, if you follow God, you live. If you disobey God, you get curses. How does the new covenant work? Well, that's what the passage that Peyton read a moment ago is all about. Before I dive into that passage, let me explain why we're talking about covenants and stuff. It's because baptism is a covenant. When you guys were baptized, you don't have any memory of it, most of you don't. But when you were baptized, there were promises made. Your parents made a promise to raise you in the church, and I want to honor all the parents here and say thank you for keeping that promise. They promised to raise you in the church, and then the church made a promise, just like they're going to do later on today. The promise was that they would surround you with their witness and with their love and help you grow up knowing the faith. And now we think you have come to an age where you're old enough that you can make your own promises. And you have a choice about whether you are going to enter into this covenant that was made for you at some point in your history. You have a choice today whether to enter into that covenant and be part of God's covenant people, the church. So let me explain how the covenant works. Let's start with what Paul was writing to the Romans. He says, summarizing the Moses, he says, the righteousness that comes from the law says, the person who does these things will live by them. He's basically taking that long passage I read a moment ago, Deuteronomy 30, and he's condensing it down to 10 words. If you want to live, obey the law. If you want to die, disobey the law. But that's the righteousness that comes from the law. But then Paul is talking about the second covenant. He says there's a different kind of righteousness, a different way of being made right with God. And this doesn't come from the law. This righteousness comes from faith. And so what does it say, this righteousness? It says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, on your lips and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we proclaim. For how many of you is that confusing? Seriously? No one raised their hands. You guys are like biblical experts because that is so confusing to me. What is Paul talking? Thank you, Nathan, for your honesty. My son, my fourth grader. It's so confusing. Like, what is Paul talking about? Well, he's quoting Moses. All the way back in Deuteronomy 30, those passages that I read just a moment ago, the verses right before it, here's what Moses says. Moses says, surely this commandment that I'm commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. It's not up in heaven that you have to say, who's going to go up to heaven for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it. Neither is it across the sea that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it. No, the word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. What Moses is saying there is like, you don't have to go find out, like ask, what does God want me to do? He's made it clear. He already gave us the 10 commandments. I went up on a mountain. I brought down the tablets. I broke them. I went back up on the mountain. I did it again. You know what the word is. It's near to you. All you got to do is do it. But Paul is changing the words. Did you catch that? Go back to Paul's version. He says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? But it's not to bring the law down. It's to bring Christ down. He said, we don't have to bring Christ down. Christ has already come down. He says, in the same way, you don't have to ask who's going to descend into the abyss. Moses said across the sea, but that's kind of a translation thing. But Paul says you don't have to ask who's going to go down in the abyss. That is to bring Christ up from the dead. He's already been raised from the dead. He says, but what does it say? The word is near you, on your lips and in your heart. And then he puts in parentheses, that is the word of faith that we proclaim. Do you see the word substitution? Moses was talking about the law and the commandments. Do them and you live. Paul is saying it's about Jesus and about faith. And that changes the verb, because no longer is the commandment for us to obey the law. Rather, Paul is saying what you have to do in order to enter into the next covenant is simply believe. He says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. For one believes with the heart and so is justified, and one confesses with the mouth and so is saved. That is what is required. Not obedience, but faith and trust. Let me unpack these words just a little bit. When you see the word confess, most of the time when we hear the word confess, we think of like confessing sin, like fess up, I know what you did last summer. Kids, that goes over your heads. That's for my generation. That's like a bad horror movie. Anyway, so but I know what you did. Like that's what we mean normally when we say confess, but that's not what Paul means. The Greek word for confess, it just means to agree. So to confess is to agree, to say out loud, to agree with others that Jesus is Lord. And then he says, but that belief has to be backed, or that confession with your mouth has to be backed up with something in your heart. In just a moment, you guys are going to confess your faith. You're all going to stand up here. Perry's going to ask you some questions. You're going to say, I do, we do, we do. But if all you do is confess with your mouth but not believe in your heart, it's just words. But when our heart lines up with our words, that's when something incredible happens. Paul says, when that happens, we are saved. Now, what does that mean, to be saved? I mean, I grew up and I always thought being saved was about going to heaven. That was the way it was talked about, that like we had these debates about whether you're once saved, always saved, if it was possible to lose your salvation. But in the Bible, salvation is so much more than going to heaven. And there's this story that you all knew it. It was about Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, right? And he climbed up in a tree to see Jesus, and Jesus saw him and said, come on down, I'm going to your house today. And then Zacchaeus promised that I will, give back all of my money to anyone I've wronged, and I'll pay back and help the poor. And when he does this, Jesus says something. He says, today salvation has come to this house. He doesn't say like someday salvation will come to Zacchaeus. He says today, and the here and now, salvation has come. Because someone who was lost has been found. Someone who was broken has been healed. Someone who was crooked has been made straight. You see, salvation is about healing and wholeness. And it's available to us at any moment when we believe. Donald Miller is one of my favorite authors. He was your guys' age. He was in middle school when a teacher came up to him, an English teacher. And that English teacher said to him, Donald, you write really well. Would you mind writing an article in the newspaper? He said, my whole life turned around on that moment. But here's what he meant by that. He said, when I was young, my father left our family. And so I always had this hole inside me. I always felt on some level rejected, like I wasn't good enough. And this was maybe the first male figure, like adult male figure, who told me I was good at something. And it meant the world, and so I said, okay, I'll do it. I agreed, and he wrote that article for the paper, and he says, then something happened. People read the article, and other people started saying it was good. And every person that kept telling him, wow, you're a good writer, it kept filling that hole in his heart. And then Donald said, from that moment forward, I began to pursue a false redemption. What do you mean by that, a false redemption? He said, because I was trying to establish worth for myself by my writing. That as long as I was a good writer, then I was okay. And he says, we all pursue a false redemption. Some of us, we pursue a false redemption by being good at sports, being athletic. Some of us, it's about appearance, being popular. Some of us is about smarts, being right all the time. We all pursue some way of establishing our own worth in front of our peers. But the reason Donald Miller says it was false is he said, it never filled that hole. It only filled it for a short period of time, and then it would go away. And then it was like every time I wrote an article, every time I wrote a book as an adult, it was like my whole life hinged on what people thought about it. Because if anyone criticized it, it was like blowing me apart because my whole salvation hinged on being a good writer. And he said it never could completely fill my heart. It was false. And every single one of us, we pursue at some level a false redemption. But here's the thing, Paul is saying that we don't save ourselves. We can't save ourselves. We are saved when we believe in Jesus. And so kids, this is the most important part I want you to hear. That you don't have to be popular to prove, to earn your approval. And you don't have to be perfect to establish your worth. And you don't have to be right all the time to have it all figured out. We are every single one of us, no matter our age, we are every single one of us imperfect, finite, and flawed. But the only way we get saved is by believing in one who is perfect and one who is infinite. And when we believe that Jesus loved us so much that he was willing to die for us, then God works something new in our heart. We enter into the new covenant. I was 13 years old. How many of you are 13? A lot of you. I was 13 years old when I accepted Christ into my heart. I wasn't same grade level as you. I was going into 9th grade, somewhere between 8th and 9th grade. In 8th grade, I don't know about you guys, middle school, I'm not going to do a show of hands on this one, but for how many of us was middle school a tough time, right? Like it's just Nathan, put your hand down. You're not even in middle school. So middle school was tough for me. And it wasn't just, body changing and all that kind of stuff. I'm totally freaking you guys out now. But anyways, it's not that. It was more for me. My dad died when I was young. He didn't leave like Donald Miller's case, but that still put a hole in me, And for me, the way I tried to fill that hole, the only thing I was really good at was being smart, making good grades, which all that did was earn me a nickname of being a nerd, which that didn't fill the hole, really, And my best friend was a year older than me. So we were good as long as I was with Phil, but he was a year older than me. So when he went to high school in 9th grade and I was stuck in middle school in 8th grade, that was a rough year. And so the next summer, Philip, my best friend, invited me to go to the youth group with him. And because the youth group, you had to be at least going into 9th grade to start going to youth group. And so I started going to youth group. And that was the first time I remembered anyone telling me the gospel. Like I grew up learning Bible stories, Zacchaeus, Noah, Moses, all the stuff we've been talking about. But I never put it together and understood that Jesus died for me and that I had a choice about how to respond to that. And I remember one night a senior in the youth group gave his testimony. He said, comparing your life to all of eternity is like comparing one grain of sand to all the beaches and sands of the world. And I started thinking, and that whole metaphor just blew my mind. And I was like, okay, God, I'll take that deal. I can do that. I'll give you my little grain and I get all the sands in the world. And so that night, sitting in my room, I asked Jesus to come into my heart. And the funny thing is, I felt nothing. I thought I did it wrong, right? So then I screwed up like all of my energy and I prayed it again. I changed the words. I thought it was like some magical formula. I kept praying and praying and praying. all night long. And I finally gave up. I was like, well, hopefully one of those was the right way to do it. And I went to bed, went to sleep. And then for the next 6 months, I kept really, I wasn't sure. And so I did the thing that a lot of Christians do. I thought, well, I don't know if Jesus is in my heart, but I'm gonna start praying every day. I'm gonna read my Bible every day. I'm gonna start rooting sin out of my life. I had a little bit of a potty mouth, and I was determined that I was not gonna cuss anymore because I didn't want to dishonor. I was trying to earn my approval, be the best Christian there was, right? And any time I went to a conference or church, I must have prayed 100 times for Jesus to enter my heart. And it wasn't until 6 months later, that Christmas, we went to a conference, and there was a speaker there who was talking about God's love. And I remember him saying that God's love is there whether you believe it or not, whether you feel it or not. It's just always there. And so I prayed. I probably prayed this similarly other times, but I said, God, I don't know if you're real, but if you are, I just want to know your love. And that was the first time, as John Wesley would describe it, that I ever felt my heart strangely warmed. And it was enough for me to believe that God was real. And it was the best feeling in the world, to know that I was loved. Not because of my performance, not because I was smart, not because of anything else. All those feelings of shame that I had, didn't matter. God loved me. And so for the next, I don't know how long, all my prayers to God were just simply me telling God, I love you, I love you, I love you, and then just feeling that I love you coming back. And I wish I could tell you that the rest of my life was that way, that I never wandered away from that moment, but I did, same as everyone does. I had confusion and doubts, and sometimes I made mistakes I wish I could take back, but the reality is nothing changed about God's love. It is always there and is always constant. And believing in that love has made all the difference in my journey. And now you guys have that option, this moment we're about to come to, confirmation, where you get to choose whether you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord. You get to enter into the promise. And look, it's good to make promises to God. It's good to promise that you're always going to love him, you're always going to follow him. But even better is knowing that God meets you in that covenant, and God promises always to love you, always to forgive you, always to guide you throughout your whole life. And anytime you wander away, as soon as you just turn around, he is ready and waiting to embrace you back, right? You will never be forgotten. So back to Lewis Smedes, that quote that I said way at the beginning of this sermon. He also says this. He says, some people ask, who am I? And they expect the answer to come from their accomplishments. And some people ask, who am I? And they expect the answer to come from their feelings. And some people ask, who am I? And they expect the answer to come from what other people think of them. He says, but the real source of our identity comes from the promises we make and keep, and the promises we believe and we trust. Today, you have the opportunity to claim an identity, to make a promise, but more importantly, just making a promise, to receive a promise from God through his Son that you are his child. You are precious and beloved in his sight. And all of us celebrate and renew that promise with you today.